We all know about TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, where $700 billion taxpayer dollars went to bail out the banks in 2008. That money was scrutinized by Congress and the media. But it turns out that $700 billion is just a small part of a much larger pool of money that has gone into propping up our nation's financial system. And most of that taxpayer money hasn't had much public scrutiny at all. According to a team at Bloomberg News, at one point last year, the U.S. had lent, spent, or guaranteed as much as $12.8 trillion to rescue the economy. That's trillion with a T. The Bloomberg reporters have been following that money, and I sat down with one of them, Bob Ivry, to talk about the true cost to the taxpayer of the Wall Street bailout. Over the past few years, you've been looking into the money, not just the TARP money, but this whole other cauldron of money that a lot of people aren't aware of. Tell me about what started the conversation about looking at this other pot of money.
Well, we about the time of the big meltdown, which was September and October of 2008, we were covering things on a day-to-day basis, and said, well, what can we do to show the big picture here? We took one of those whiteboards and just started writing all the programs down and how much money was going out and how much money was being guaranteed to the banks. So we decided that we tally up all the emergency programs, all the lending programs from all over the government, and we came up with $12.8 trillion, and that was compared to $700 billion. It dwarfed TARP. TARP is something that really needs scrutiny, no doubt. But when you talk about how small TARP is compared to the overall commitment of taxpayer money, it's really, really tiny.
So let me just reiterate, $700 billion for TARP,
yes,
$12.8 trillion and
yes,
everything else.
Yeah.
What's everything else?
Yeah. These are all the kind of lending and borrowing mechanisms that normal folks don't even know about, but folks in finance rely on them in order to keep all the juices going of the financial system. And they were really in danger of collapsing after the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy.
So here's the breakdown. When the reporters added up all the emergency programs at the Federal Reserve, things like the rescue of Citigroup and AIG, it was $7.7 trillion. At the Treasury, another $2.7 trillion. That includes the $700 billion from TARP, the stimulus packages, and tax breaks for banks, among other things. And at the FDIC, another $2 trillion. The grand total, according to Bloomberg's reporting, $12.8 trillion at its peak. That's more than 18 times the amount allocated for TARP. To be clear, not all this money actually went out the door. Much was in the form of guarantees to banks against future losses so that the banks wouldn't fail. But in the event that things got worse, those guarantees would have become actual costs for the U.S. government. At the Federal Reserve, there were all kinds of emergency lending programs with names like ABCP Liquidity and Term Asset-Backed Loan Facility. But for some of these programs, there was no way to tell who was receiving the money and what the government was getting in return. So you and your colleagues look at this whiteboard and you decide, we want to know where that money's going. What happened next?
My colleague Mark Pittman said, well, let's see who's borrowing from the Federal Reserve in this kind of crisis atmosphere. Who's borrowing from the Federal Reserve? How much are they borrowing? And what are they giving the Federal Reserve back in the way of collateral? And the Federal Reserve said, no, we don't want to tell you. And so we appealed, and the Federal Reserve said, no, we're not going to tell you. You have the most powerful institutions in America spending trillions, lending and guaranteeing trillions of taxpayer money, and not telling us why or how or where or who's getting it. So Mark said, you know what? I want to sue the Federal Reserve to get them to cough up this information because it's not Ben Bernanke's money, it's our money.
What does the newsroom say when Mark Pittman, who we should mention has since passed away, what did the newsroom say when Mark Pittman said, guess what, I'm going to sue the Fed?
His line editor at the time was Emma Moody, and she says, who sues the Fed? One reporter on the planet, and that was Mark Pittman. He was just a guy who really didn't have any fear, and he wasn't intimidated by the central bank of the largest economy in the world. It was his money, and it was our money, and it wasn't their money.
So Bloomberg LP filed a lawsuit against the Federal Reserve Board to release records of this unprecedented multi-trillion-dollar loan program.
One of the things that I've learned from working at Bloomberg as a financial journalist is that you can trust what people say, or you can take a look at what they do. And it's much more advantageous to take a look at what they do. And if you don't have the data, and they do, and they don't want to give it to you, you have to use every means at your disposal to get it. And that's why we're suing them.
Bloomberg won its case against the Federal Reserve last August. The court gave the Fed 5 days to disclose the emergency loan information. But the Fed appealed, joined by the Clearinghouse, a group of some of the nation's largest banks. Since then, the appellate court has twice affirmed the district court's decision compelling disclosure of the loans, once as recently as 2 weeks ago. The bottom line? The Federal Reserve has to either turn over the documents or appeal the case to the Supreme Court. The Federal Reserve's lawyers, their argument about not releasing these documents, and I'm going to quote this: "The real-world consequences of the panel's decision will be serious, perhaps irreparable harm to the institutional borrowers whose information will be revealed." Mm-hmm. Why isn't that a concern for you?
Because I and the federal judges that ruled in favor of Bloomberg and my colleagues here at Bloomberg don't agree with that. I don't think it's true.
What's the bank's fear?
They're saying in their lawsuit, in the response to the lawsuit, that there would be a stigma to borrowing, and that the Federal Reserve, which is the lender of last resort, they would be loath to go to the Federal Reserve in an emergency if they knew that information would be made public.
It would be a scarlet letter.
It would be a mark that says we're in trouble, and they don't want people to know that they're in trouble.
Tell me why you became so personally invested in this story.
I think part of it is that the lack of people that are looking at this. There seems to be only a handful of people that seem to care about it enough to write about it, or to shout about it, or to sue about it. The people out there across the country do care about this. They feel powerless, however, because you're talking about the most powerful institutions in America. You're talking about the Federal Reserve Bank, which can create money. You're talking about the U.S. Treasury, which has a lot of power. And you're talking about the whole executive branch of the government. So it's good to be an objective journalist, but every once in a while you have to be a citizen too. And I am passionate about this because I do see it as unfair and undemocratic.
The financial system did not collapse. Did they do anything right? Was there anything right about giving all these banks this money?
I think that there's an argument to be made that they did everything right, that nothing that they did was a misstep, and you'll get a lot of people to say that. On the other hand, you'll get a lot of people to say that, starting with the Bear Stearns bailout, it created an atmosphere of moral hazard, that folks in the financial industry could do whatever they wanted to take as many risks as they could, and that made the eventual near collapse that much worse. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the answer is. It's not really my job to say. My job is to point out where the promise and the reality are at odds. There's a gap, and that's where I work. I work between the gap between the promise and the reality.
Is it this big a gap right now, or this big?
I always think it's this big. I think there's a lot of work to do in that gap between the reality and the promise.